All right, welcome everyone to this webinar on metacognitive skill building. I am Dr. Catlin Tucker. I'm very excited to be with you all today. This is a webinar mode, and so I've gotten questions in past sessions, just like people can't, they don't see an area for you guys to talk, and so it's not a meeting in Zoom, it's a webinar, which means the best way for you to ask me questions or to share is in the chat window, and I think the chat setting is only going to allow me. So let me give you guys permission. So you guys can now hopefully post to everybody, myself included. So if you have questions, you can throw them in the chat window. I'm happy to take those throughout our time together today. As those of you who have joined me before know, I like to start all of my sessions with a welcome activity, a way to kind of get to know kind of who's in the room, give you guys a chance to share out, but also just to model the importance, even in a situation like this where we are online and we can't like unmute and talk to each other, just that important moment of like human connection, right? I know for a lot of us, building community in our classrooms is a real area of focus and interest. A lot of us might have kind of a focus on social emotional learning. And so beginning time together, be it a class, a training, a meeting with some kind of check-in is a really wonderful way just to help people connect, even if it's super informal. So you guys are beating me to the punch. You're already saying hi in the chat window. Thank you. I would love for you, if you feel so inclined, to just kind of share what you teach, where you teach, what you're interested in learning today, or why you chose a session on metacognitive skill building. And then the icebreaker question, if you want to share it in the chat window, is what would constitute like a perfect day for you? So we'll spend just like 90 seconds, 2 minutes checking in the chat, letting you guys say hello, answering the icebreaker question. I will set my timer for 2 minutes, and at the 2-minute mark, I'm going to share with you the resource document for this session, and we're going to dive right in. So I'll mute myself while you guys check in the chat window. All right, so lots of different age levels and grades represented, some science teachers, special ed, just kind of elementary teachers. So exciting to see the mix in the room. We have some folks saying their perfect day would be at the beach, definitely a rejuvenating experience. So if you have a perfect day, what would constitute it? Feel free to throw it in there as well. We've got about 45 seconds left. All right, so we got a lot of shout outs to perfect days being at the beach. Some of us are just like in the sunshine with a good book, a picnic with my son, which I love. I'm not sure my 14-year-old son would be super stoked to go on a picnic with me, but I would love the experience for sure. So thank you guys. And I would really encourage you, for those of you who have joined me before, I'm throwing a document into the chat window right now. and it is going to take you to this resource document. And one of the things that I include in each of my resource documents when I pull you guys together and model this check-in is a slide deck that has a whole bunch of conversation starters. So whether it's part of a welcome task at the beginning of a class, whether you are trying to engage kids in kind of a check-in before a small group discussion or a collaborative task, just something to kind of help them break the ice can be really, really wonderful. And also make some of those connections with their peers, like realizing that there are these points of commonality in a classroom. So that is there for you. Hopefully I shared this properly. So you guys can either bookmark this, you can make a copy of it, but all of the resources you're going to see in my presentation today, any of the templates or the routines around metacognitive skill building, they are in here. So you guys have access to them. So if at the end of this session, I would highly suggest you at the very least kind of bookmark this so you have it moving forward, and you can take some of these ideas. Let's see, Jessica can't see it. I'll throw it back into the chat window. There you go, Jessica. And that way, anything that your interest is peaked around, you should have everything you need at the end of our time today to kind of act on it, to take a resource and play with it. And then you guys can always track me down online if between now and the next webinar, you have a question, you try something, you're looking for some resource specifically, feel free to reach out. You still can't see it. Let me see. Well, I've got one person on here, but let me try this link one more time. Oh, I'm sorry, you guys. I'm sharing it with the panelists instead of you guys. That's great. I do this all the time and I still make these mistakes. So hold on one second. Here you go. You guys should all be able to see that now. My apologies. All right. So you've got this document, you have access to all these resources, like I said. And again, if you have any questions between now and when we might see each other again, because I have a few more of these in May, feel free to reach out online. My website, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you hang out online, I'm sure that you can track me down. So I want to start with the why behind metacognition. So I want to give you guys just like 45, 60 seconds. Why did you choose this session? What do you think is valuable about metacognitive skill building? Obviously, something kind of drew you to this particular session. And I think when we do some of these routines with our students, we want to be very transparent about why we're doing them, right? What is the value proposition of metacognitive skill building, right? So Constance is saying, thinking about your thinking. There's a lot of value in being able to understand your thinking and your learning on a deeper level. For me, when I talk with educators, I really try to kind of get them answering the why so that they can think about what is the purpose from their perspective. But also, there's not a lot of classrooms that I go in currently where I see metacognitive skill building routines happening, right? Even though, as you guys are pointing out, it's really important, not just for understanding yourself, but understanding other people, becoming more self-aware. All of those things are really, really important. And so when we think about why don't we see this more often, why do you guys think that is? Like, what are some of the challenges that might make metacognitive skill building like hard to weave into a classroom, right? Is it time? Is it like feeling pressure to cover curriculum and this feels like something else? Because what I hope you walk away from today kind of recognizing or thinking about is how important metacognitive skill building is to that idea of social emotional learning, but also the idea of helping students to develop the skills so that they can be our true partners in this work. I want students to share the responsibility of learning with us, their teachers, but if they're not comfortable thinking about their thinking, if they're not comfortable thinking about their learning and what does my work in this area tell me about my skill set, it's going to be very hard for us to truly partner with our students. And so today, I really want us to think about One, what is that value proposition from our perspective? How do we articulate it for our learners, however age they're at or whatever level they're at? And then what challenges are we hoping that metacognitive skill building are really going to help us address as we work with learners? So some ideas in case you're like, well, I do think it's important to think about our thinking. Some things we can kind of add to this is there's research to show it positively impacts academic achievement and motivation when students are comfortable thinking about their thinking, thinking about their learning. It can help them to also become more flexible and agile learners, kind of instead of being, frustrated when they hit those barriers, they hit those challenges, being able to kind of maneuver and think about, this didn't work, but I tried this strategy in the past, or, ooh, this is a resource that was helpful in the past that I might want to lean on in this moment. It's really key to helping to develop those self-directed learners, right? Learners who are capable of driving their own experience. So when we talk about, we want learners to succeed and feel confident, whether they're in a classroom, online, or a blend of the two, it does require more self-direction, right? Even when I work with elementary teachers and we are designing a station rotation where the teacher is leading a small group, there's an online station, an offline station, those young learners have to have the kind of skills to navigate the learning and direct their learning as, individuals at those stations. So the teacher can work with small groups to differentiate instruction, give feedback, and do all of those things that are so meaningful in a small group dynamic. It really fosters, as I said, there is this real clear link between that metacognition and self-awareness and the development of these social emotional skills, even self-management in a classroom. It improves their ability to transfer their learning from here to a new and novel situation. That ability to transfer or apply learning is enhanced when they have confidence, kind of stretching those metacognitive muscles. And it can positively kind of impact their ability to self-regulate, which is obviously critical to thriving in any teaching and learning landscape, but particularly those where they have more control over the experience, more control over things like kind of the pace of their learning or even the path of their learning. And so I really want to focus on how the development of these skills can allow our students to be more confident navigating learning in these different landscapes. So my area of expertise is blended learning. And in the last 4 years, I've really been looking at kind of this intersection of blended learning with universal design for learning, where really the goal is to kind of shift from that very teacher-centered approach to learning, where we as educators feel a lot of pressure to kind of transfer information, to explain and unpack complex concepts, to model strategies and skills at the front of the room. And instead kind of lean on these technology enhanced instructional models to shift from that very teacher-led approach to a more student-centered design, where the teacher is kind of freed from that pressure of feeling like they have to be at the front of the room the whole time transferring information, and instead are kind of freed to sit alongside small groups or individual learners to facilitate learning, right? To guide small group differentiated instruction, to provide feedback and corrective kind of notes as students are working on a task or an assignment, to conference and have conversations about their progress, or even to kind of facilitate interactive differentiated modeling sessions so students can be more successful taking a new strategy and skill and attempting to apply it. So as we kind of explore these different blended learning models, this is really the goal. Because if we think about what technology does really well, technology does transfer of information quite well, right? We can read an article, students can expand a text, they can look up words, they can watch a video, pause it, rewind it, rewatch it. They can listen to a podcast, engage with an interactive website to acquire or gather new information. So if technology does transfer of information well, we want to lean on that as much as possible to free ourselves to do the most important work that we're good at that technology isn't, right? The observing, the listening, the organically responding to students' needs, engaging in conversation about their progress, really empathizing and being compassionate with them. All of these things are so incredibly important, and it's what we do as humans really well. And so we want to lean on these models to create more time for that. So really at its core, blended learning is simply just this active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning offline. And the goal of this online offline combination is to really shift control from teacher to learner, giving students more opportunities to control things like time, place, pace, and path. And what I love about blended learning is really that it can happen entirely in a classroom, right? I work in lots of classrooms where they'll use things like the station rotation model, the playlist model, and it all occurs in the physical classroom. But they're also flexible enough to work on a hybrid schedule or entirely online, which is really exciting in terms of giving teachers a really robust tool belt full of models they can use in any teaching and learning landscape. But the more control we give to learners, the more we have to support them in making good choices when they have more control. And metacognitive skill building can really help them to do that. And as we kind of go through today's session, looking at different strategies, I would encourage you to kind of think about some of these core beliefs that are like underpinning this idea of universal design for learning, which is really about making sure learning is accessible, inclusive, and equitable, and blended learning, this real combination of online and offline learning. So 4 core beliefs at the heart of this that I want us thinking about moving into this session is 1, learner variability is the norm, right? Kids are just different from each other in terms of their skills, their needs, their backgrounds, their language proficiencies, their learning preferences. And as we start to acknowledge that, it makes sense to question, why would we use a single lesson or a single approach for such a diverse group of learners? So as we go through the strategies today, we want to be thinking about, how do we make sure we're not setting students up to kind of hit a barrier, right? We want to really strive to design learning experiences and these metacognitive routines they're going to try to remove barriers for learners. And often the best way to remove a barrier is simply to just give students a meaningful choice so they can choose a pathway that is going to work for them. Because we know all students can reach kind of firm standard aligned goals, but the pathways they take to get there might be different. And another kind of core belief is just this idea that students can and should be expert learners. And that doesn't mean they're good at everything. It means that they're aware of their strengths, they're aware of their limitations, they're motivated, they're strategic, they're resourceful, and they can advocate for their needs. And I think that's really what we're striving for when we teach metacognitive skill building kind of routines and procedures is, I want to help you as learners develop that expert learner profile, thinking about what strategies you might use, what resources, where are your strengths, where are your limitations, where might you need more support. So as we get into kind of metacognition and kind of how that links to this idea of cultivating expert learners, I like to kind of break something like metacognition down into really concrete kind of steps and categories. So often when I work with teachers, metacognition can feel a little abstract. It's like, well, it's thinking about our thinking, but how do we get kids doing that in a consistent way in our classrooms and really weave it into the fabric of our work with students? So I like to think about metacognitive skill building in 3 parts. First is kind of what happens before the learning or at the start of a learning cycle. During is like what is happening during a learning cycle to get students thinking about their thinking and thinking about their learning. And then what is happening at the end of a lesson or learning cycle to get students thinking about how effective that particular experience was. So we're going to tackle it through these kind of three lenses and start with the before, which really kind of encompasses one, goal setting, and two, getting students to kind of plan and be strategic before they jump into an assignment, right? Let's not just kind of jump into it without thinking about how we want to approach it, what strategies we might use, what materials we might need, what resources would be helpful. So when we think about goal setting, what's really fascinating about getting students setting goals, not using like a program to spit out goals at them, but really asking learners, what do you care about? What do you want to work toward? What's interesting is it kind of connects to this idea of the motivational spectrum. So we obviously, as educators, would love all of our students to just be intrinsically motivated to kind of engage in learning, whether it's just intrinsically motivated by our subject area or learning in general. But we know that's probably not going to happen. You're not going to have a classroom necessarily full of intrinsically motivated students. So how do we move them down the spectrum of motivation to at least get to the place of identified regulation? And the reason identified regulation is something that I think we can all shoot for and we can all kind of strive to achieve is it's this moment where students realize that either their actions and behaviors are taking them further away from things they care about and want to achieve, or they're bringing them closer to things they care about and want to achieve. And so when we ask students, hey, what is a personal, academic, behavioral goal you care about that you want to work toward, all of a sudden that can start to kind of frame and focus their energy and efforts in our class because they're starting to realize either what I'm doing is helping me make progress toward this thing I care about, or it's taking me further away. And there are lots of different strategies that we can use to get students setting goals. So I'm going to go through a few of them, just knowing that like students are variable or there's learner variability, you guys are going to be drawn to different resources here. And you're obviously welcome to make a copy of any of these resources and kind of play around with them, work with them so that they'll be a good fit for your students at your particular grade level. So this graphic organizer approach moves students from kind of a, where am I going? How will I get there? How will I know when I've arrived sequence? So the where am I going? What do I want to achieve is where they articulate their goals. And you might give students the option to kind of think about a mix of academic, personal, behavioral goals, and maybe have one of each, or at least require maybe one academic goal and let them play with the other two. It's totally up to you, but I like the idea of giving students some agency and choice about the kinds of goals that they're setting for themselves. So we're truly tapping into something hopefully they care about. That's the difference between this approach to goal setting and say having your reading program kind of spit out a goal for students, is they have more ownership over these goals. The middle column is the how will I get there, right? And this is where we want them to think really intentionally about what behaviors, what choices, what actions do I think are going to help me make progress toward these goals I've set for myself. And you can decide, do you want them to set goals that they can achieve hopefully by the end of a handful of weeks? Is this tied to a unit or a grading period? It depends on what you feel is sustainable for your particular class. And then we want to ask them, what do you think success is going to look and feel like? We want them picturing that moment when they are successful and trying to articulate what they think it will look like. So the version you guys have of this is in a Google Drawing, but you can go to File and download it as a PDF if you want to use it offline or online with students, depending on your preference. Another strategy for goal setting, which I like for kind of short form goals, either if you're going to have students set one goal for the week, or maybe if you're doing a particular type of project or assignment that you want students to set a goal in relation to, this can be a wonderful way to do that. Like in relation to this project or this writing assignment, this is the one goal I really want to set for myself. Or, hey, it's Monday morning in this week, this is the goal I really want to focus on and work toward. So they tend to be kind of more kind of focused goals, but it can be a really nice way to get them thinking through, why are you setting this goal? Is it why, or how is it meaningful or valuable for you? What are you going to do to work toward this goal? What behaviors might help you be more successful reaching this goal? And then again, what do you think, success looks and feels like once you've achieved this goal? So this is a fun one as well. A more elaborate and definitely more secondary feeling goal setting kind of approach is that SMART goal, where you might have students set 3 goals for themselves over the course of like a 6-week grading period, and then ask them to move through the process of, is this goal specific? How will I measure my progress toward this particular goal? Is it attainable given my time and energy resources, right? Often at the middle school and high school level, there's a lot competing for students' time and attention, whether it's sports or an after school job. And so making sure that they have the time and energy to hopefully achieve this particular goal. How is it relevant to their lives? And is it timely? Like, is it something that they can truly achieve in the window of time they're going to be working on it? Because what we don't want is students setting goals and then not feeling successful reaching those goals. And when we have students setting goals, one of the things I would really recommend is kind of going through the process of modeling this for learners, right? So whichever of the goal setting strategies you are gravitating toward, it's really important to dedicate class time to demonstrating, conducting a think aloud, so students can see you set a goal and walk through the process. I think one of the mistakes I made with my own students was assuming that this was pretty straightforward, and that when I asked them to set a goal for themselves, that they would be able to do it. But just like any other skill that we teach in our class, we're going to have to onboard our learners to the process. We have to articulate why we think it's valuable, model the process of walking through a goal setting procedure with them, and then ideally dedicate class time to this work. Because what we communicate to learners when we dedicate class time to a task is that we value it. And so definitely building it into the fabric of your class, whether it's setting goals on a Monday using like a single goal setting sheet, whether it's setting them at the beginning of a grading period and kind of moving through the process of completing a more elaborate goal setting kind of strategy, just making sure we're really guiding the process like we would guide any other routine, procedure, activity that we do in our classes. When we think about that pre-planning kind of strategizing component, I think what we want students to be kind of getting in the habit of doing is when they approach a task or a project or assignment, asking questions. What do I already know about this topic, this subject, this issue? What do I want to learn? What do I hope to understand at the end of completing whatever the assignment is? What strategies have I used in the past that might be helpful navigating this particular task? And those could be strategies like how to solve particular types of problems. They could be strategies around time management, and then getting them really thinking about what is their support system like? What are the resources available to them if they get stuck? I think the more we kind of like slow down and ask them to just kind of reflect on these things before diving into an assignment or a project or even a complex task, all of a sudden we help them to kind of develop a little bit of confidence that like, hey, I've done challenging things in the past. What have I done then that might help me now? And really get them being much more thoughtful about their work before they dive in. So one of the strategies I've used with learners in the past is really asking them to kind of take a moment and plan their attack, right? Before beginning the assignment, taking a few moments to really reflect and plan and lean on their resources and articulate how they think they're going to go about this work. And so kind of thinking through, what is your goal for this assignment? What do you already know about this? How do you plan to kind of tackle this in a step-by-step kind of approach? what strategies might be useful here. And based on what you're seeing in this initial stage, is there any aspect of this particular assignment that might be particularly challenging? And if so, where can you get help? Is there peer support? Are there resources in the classroom? Obviously, you have the teacher. The middle part of that metacognitive skill building is the during. And there are lots of ways to kind of raise student awareness of their thinking and also of their learning and progress as we're moving through a learning cycle or a unit. So one of my favorite strategies, especially when learners are really not super comfortable thinking about their thinking, are the thinking routines out of Harvard's Graduate School of Education. So the quote reads, "Thinking routines are simple yet powerful tools you can use to help students develop into metacognitive and strategic learners. With dedicated time to reflect on their thinking process, students can develop a deeper understanding of the strategies they used and the ideas they developed." So there are a ton of these thinking routines. Some of them you've probably encountered even if you didn't realize there was a larger collection of them. So I work with teachers a lot who have used this thinking routine from Project Zero, the Harvard Graduate School of Education group. And basically it walks students through a what do you see, what do you think, what do you wonder? So whether you are kind of showing them photographs or graphics and charts, or even asking them to watch video clips, getting them to really start to think about, what am I seeing? What details are important? What am I pulling out from what I'm noticing? What am I thinking about? And then what am I wondering? What questions are surfacing for me, right? So any type of engagement with visual media can benefit from kind of a see, think, wonder routine. I also love the connect, extend challenge, right? So as students are learning something new, really asking them to pause and answer, like, how does this connect to what you already knew about this topic, this subject, this issue? How is what you're learning now kind of extending or stretching your thinking about this topic, subject, or issue? And then what are you finding challenging or confusing? What are you wondering about? So this is a really nice way. Again, kids are making this bridge between their prior knowledge and what they're learning, understanding how the readings and the conversations and the videos and the instruction are really stretching their thinking on a topic, and then allowing them the space to say, yeah, I'm not sure about this. I have a question about this aspect of it. It's just a really nice way as a teacher to kind of encourage that thinking, but also to collect some really interesting kind of formative assessment data from learners. Another favorite of mine is the I used to think, now I think. So obviously students may walk into a unit or a lesson, a sequence of lessons, a learning cycle, having some preconceived kind of notions about something or understanding parts of it. So asking them to articulate for this subject, for this unit, what did you used to think about this issue, this topic, this subject? And now what do you think based on a lesson, a series of readings, some class discussions, a unit of study? What are you thinking now? And what has caused your thinking to shift? What changed for you? So this is a really interesting moment where kids can start to appreciate the impact of the learning that is happening on the way that they're actually thinking about these topics. So what I wanted to give you guys a chance to do before jumping to an entirely different strategy was to allow you to check out the entire, I basically took 10 of my favorite thinking routines and put them into a digital format. So you can check out the Harvard Graduate School of of Education's Project Zero site where they have done all of this work. But I wanted to make sure you guys had all of my digital versions of these slide decks. So I took basically 10 of them and I created slide decks that look like this. So you can obviously use these offline in a PDF form, print them out, or you can have everybody in the class kind of jump on a single Google slide deck grab a slide, put their name at the bottom, and complete a thinking routine. So as you go through this activity, what I would say is for those of you in kind of K-5 arena, I would stick to thinking routines 1 through 5. Those of you in the secondary realm, 6 through 10 are wonderful, but they're a little bit more complex. So I'm going to throw into the chat window, and I want to make sure I add this to your guys's resource document in case you end up really liking them. But I want to give you 5 minutes to kind of just explore that folder. I want you to choose the thinking routine you're most interested in. So maybe open a few of them, check them out. And once you've landed on one that you're like, wow, I really like this one, I would love for you in the chat window to say, hey, this is the one I chose. I chose, compass points, and this is how I think I might use it, just so we can curate some ideas for the rest of the folks on the call who might be like interested in using thinking routines, but not exactly sure which one to start with or how to use it. All right. I can't send it to you by email, Stacy, but I can put it, I'm going to put it in here in the resource document. So I'll put the folder here. And then once you have access to it, you can actually make a copy of anything in that folder. So you guys have access to each of those 10 slide decks. All right, so while you guys are engaging this, I'm going to set my timer and I'm going to be keeping my eye on the chat window. So if you guys have questions about any of the thinking routines, you want to bounce ideas off of me about how you might use them, great. Otherwise, you can kind of dig into the folder, choose one, and then brainstorm a couple of ways you might use it and share it in the chat window. All right, so I'm going to mute myself so I'm not distracting you guys as you do this. You guys got about 45 seconds or so. So if you have a chance to kind of share the one you were excited about and how you think you might use it, I would love to get some ideas curated in the chat window for people who are kind of looking for additional ideas. All right, so hopefully you stumbled onto one, maybe a couple of them you're excited to use. One of the comments in the chat that I just agreed with is just like they're very versatile. Some of them can be used to kind of start that beginning of the year ice breaking community building. Others are really great for academic kind of deep dives into topics. Just a really neat collection, and they're great to weave into a classroom. So I would often use a thinking routine once students were familiar with it and we had kind of onboarded it together as a class. I would often shift that into like station work where students might read or explore and then create or work through a thinking routine. So they're really kind of a fun add to almost any class. Another thing that we can think about, so it's one thing to really get them thinking about their thinking and understanding how the work they're doing is impacting their thinking, but we also want them kind of monitoring their progress and thinking about their learning. Like one of the aspects of education that feels very unsustainable to me is this idea that somehow it's just the teacher's responsibility to like think about all of their students' learning. Really, that should be a shared responsibility between learner and teacher. And that means getting students to engage in kind of an ongoing practice of self-assessment. So when working with my own students, at the beginning of a unit of study, I would identify anywhere from like 3, max 5 target standards for that unit. It didn't mean those were the only standards I was going to hit during the unit. It just meant those were the ones I was going to hit really hard. Like I was really focused on making sure we came back to those standards over and over again. And so I would basically make a copy of what you're seeing here, which is my ongoing self-assessment document. This is very much more like secondary leaning, this version. I'll share an elementary one with you in a moment. But the idea was I would kind of articulate, these are our target standards and skills. And then once a week, students would have to select one piece of their work. And often I would let them choose. Sometimes I would require that everybody look at the same piece because it was a really important one. And they would have to align the work with the target standard they felt it was kind of focused on. Like, of these standards and skills, which do I think this piece of work is really targeting? And actually, when we first introduced the target and skills to the class, or I introduced it, I would put them in small groups and ask them to rewrite the standard and skill in their own words. So if we go back to this example, you'll see in that first column, there is actually a pink text version under the original version that's in black, because I wanted students to make sure they understand what are these standards and skills even asking of them? Because if they don't understand, it's going to be very hard to think about their progress in relation to that skill. So I'd have small groups kind of rewriting the standards in their own words, talking about it. If they got stuck, I could come in and support their process. Then once a week, and this usually happened as either a welcome activity in a whole group rotation or as an online station in a station rotation, students would either, like I said, pull an example of work from the last 7 days, or I would ask them, hey, I want everybody to take a look at this assignment and spend some time with it. Then they would have to self-assess. Based on what they were seeing in their work, where did they think they were in kind of their journey toward mastering this specific standard or skill? Are they a 1, like in the beginning stages, still in need of significant support? Were they 2, kind of developing, meaning they're starting to feel like they got the hang of it, but they're still benefiting from some support? 3, are they proficient? They feel like they've got it. Or are they 4? They feel like they've mastered it and they're ready for the next challenge. So they give themselves a score here, and then they had to engage in kind of an explanation/reflection. Why did you give yourself a particular score? So if you gave yourself a 2, why? Where are you at? What do you feel like you're still focused on developing in that space? What support might you still need? What details in your work support your self-evaluation score? What does this piece kind of demonstrate in terms of your strengths as a learner? Remember that expert learner profile. They understand their strengths. They understand their limitations. What aspect of the skill or standard are you working on or still kind of feel like you're struggling with? And what support might I give you as your teacher to help you continue making progress? And I think the most exciting part of this routine from my perspective, having used it with students, is in the beginning, they push back. They are not excited about doing this, right? It takes time. They have to engage in kind of critical thinking. They need to put, pen to paper or fingers to keys and do this reflective piece. But what's interesting is after a couple of months, I think students start to recognize the connection between the skills and standards that we need them to develop in the class and the actual assignments we're asking them to do, and how they match up. And then I would start to get students, because we did this in a Google Doc, where they would tag me in a question. They would tag me in a request for support, like, hey, Tucker, can you lead a station on this? I'm really struggling with this skill. So for me, that was like the payoff, is them starting to advocate for themselves, them starting to really understand their strengths, their weaknesses, the areas where they would benefit from more support. And then as a coach working with a lot of elementary teachers, I really wanted to figure out, how do we make this process more accessible for younger learners? And at the time I was coaching a teacher who had a 1st and 2nd grade combo, and she really liked the idea of starting this practice with her students. And so we put together this more kind of young version of the self-assessment with those hand emojis kind of signaling different levels of mastery, right? Like, ugh, I'm not feeling good about this, or I'm not sure, I could use some help, or I'm feeling good, I've got this, or I feel great, I'm ready for more. And we actually onboarded students to this at her teacher-led station in a rotation. And the first time they just talked through it, and she made the notes. The next time, students kind of did it with her support. And very slowly over the course of the first, I want to say 3-4 months of school, she kind of gradually released responsibility for students, where at first they just put an X in the box that kind of represented how they felt about an assignment, a skill. She even used it for behaviors in the class as well. And then as the year progressed, they would write a word or a phrase. And by the end of the year, they were writing like a simple sentence in the box to kind of explain why they chose a particular kind of hand emoji and what it reflected about how they were feeling. So it's exciting. And there's some research to suggest that metacognitive skill building can start as early as 3 and have benefits. So it's just a matter of figuring out, how do we make these routines accessible for young learners? What onboarding and support will they need? What will the kind of the progression or that gradual release of responsibility to them be, so that hopefully they can take over the routine at some point? Then we have the after, and this is really that reflecting on learning, kind of thinking about growth over time. And I know that reflection is a big ask, right? So many of us, we just feel short on time all the time, right? There's not enough hours in the day to do this work. And so pausing to reflect, whether you're a teacher reflecting on your practice or whether you're asking students to reflect on their learning, it does take some time. So how do we make time for these things? Could it be an exit activity, right? Starting to get them reflecting on, like, how did this lesson go for you? How are you feeling at the end of this class? Can you write? Can you draw to kind of express, why you're feeling a particular way? Really getting them to check in with themselves and how the learning is going for them, how they're feeling in the learning environment. I love simple check-ins. Again, these can be framed at the end of a class, at the end of a week, ending with like a 3-2-1 reflective practice, where you ask them, what are 3 facts or things you learned this week or today? What are 2 questions you have, or even 2 connections you were able to make? And what's one thing that surprised you? Really getting kids to just kind of stop and think about the learning in intentional ways and identify, oh, I learned this, and I'm still unclear about these things. Or, hey, I was able to connect what we learned today or this week to these other things that we've been studying or practicing or talking about. And again, these 2 examples here can be very short, like an end of class kind of exit activity. Reflection doesn't have to be long journal entries to be effective for learners. I also love video reflections, right? Flip, that used to be called Flipgrid, is a nice place to bring kids together and invite them to, whether it's reflecting on a particular assignment or project or reflecting on a unit. It's like, okay, what was the purpose of this assignment? Like, I want to hear what students say when they answer that question. What process did they use to complete it? What strategies did they lean on? Did they hit any bumps? And if so, how did they troubleshoot those bumps? And if they were going to kind of encounter a similar kind of task in the future, would they do things differently? Why or why not? I also really love kind of you can do an exit ticket like this, where you're asking students at the end of the week kind of consistently to stop and think about the learning that week, kind of asking them, like, tell me one concept, one skill, one thing you learned this week. Can you explain how you feel like you learned it? What did we do in here that was particularly effective for you? Can you describe it? What questions do you have? And I always included this last question for my my secondary students, which is, if you could design an activity to help a classmate learn what you learned this week, what would you have them do? And every once in a while, a student would submit an idea that was so fabulous. I would literally ask that student, hey, would you be willing to lead this activity? Whether it was like kind of whole group or in a small group as part of a station rotation. It was so fascinating to have them start to kind of lead the learning and communicate with their peers in a way that was just different from how I had articulated concepts or how I had explained specific skills. Sometimes hearing it from a classmate was actually much more effective. I also like things like some of you might have joined me on an earlier webinar where the check-in question was, what's your high been for the week? And what's your low been for this week? And I like to use that as a quick reflection too. Like, what was your high this week? What went really well? What did you understand? Where were you feeling confident? And what was a low? Like, what were you struggling with? What was like not working very well for you? That's another really easy way to check in. And it can be a verbal kind of reflection, or it can be something they capture in writing or drawings, or kind of giving them, again, thinking about removing barriers with meaningful choice. How can we think about engaging students in a reflective practice that's really going to work for them? Because ultimately, the more comfortable they are thinking about their thinking, the more comfortable they are thinking about their learning and their progress, the more likely we are to cultivate learners who are really kind of those expert learners. So I'm curious, as you guys kind of think about these different routines, if you want to throw your answer here into the chat window, which of the strategies, maybe it's a before strategy with goal setting, maybe it's a during strategy like the thinking routines or the ongoing self-assessment, or even kind of end of lesson, end of week kind of reflective strategies, what are you most excited to kind of move forward and try? And where might you build time for this in your class? Because that's really where these will either live in our lessons or kind of disappear after a short period of time, is if we don't have a clear structure for when we're going to engage kids in these activities, it can be hard to sustain. So could you use a welcome task to get students at the start of class on Monday setting a goal for themselves, and maybe at the end of the week on Friday reflecting on their progress toward that goal? Or maybe you build into a station rotation once a week that kind of self-assessment practice. I think as excited as we get about the different strategies, we also want to be really intentional about where could they live in our class so they feel sustainable, so they feel like something that is like we can commit to it over time. That's a question I really want you guys thinking about moving forward, because welcome tasks are great. Exit activities are wonderful. Station work can be very, very effective as well. Because ultimately what we want to cultivate, as I said, are these students who they're motivated. They see the value in the work and the routines that are happening in our classrooms. They're resourceful. So when they get stuck, they don't just kind of throw their hands up in the air. They really think about what have they done in the past? What's worked? What might they lean on this time? What resources are available? So they tend to be more strategic and confident. They're aware of their strengths. They know they have limitations, but they also start to understand their growth over time as they're kind of thinking about their progress. And so they know they can kind of embrace that growth mindset. They're always growing, they're always learning. And then hopefully we're also in these routines helping to give them a voice to advocate for themselves, right? To tell us how things are going for them. What are the questions? What are kind of the areas of confusion or need, because ultimately what we want students to kind of develop into are students who can kind of describe their needs as learners, who can report out to us as educators like, hey, this is what works for me. So what I put down here is kind of a fun activity that you might want to consider for next year, which is this idea of a seed packet, where students kind of articulate for us as the educator, how would you describe yourself? What's your ideal learning environment? How do you like to be challenged? When do you typically need support? So really thinking about maybe putting one of these together for our students to show them what this kind of seed packet overview of their needs is, or of our needs is, and then engaging them and putting one together for us. Because this whole idea came from Shelley Moore. And she talks about how when you buy seeds to plant in your garden, on the back, you kind of have everything you need to know, like a quick overview to help that seed grow into a plant. And what we want our students to do is to understand themselves well enough to begin to create their own little seed packet for us, right? Not for those of us who are familiar with special ed, not the really long individual education kind of overview plans, the IEP, but just a snapshot of this learner and what this learner thinks they need to be successful. So I thought that's a fun activity that I just included in your resource document for anybody who is excited to kind of check that out. I put my example, I put a template, and I even put a template with sentence stems if you're working with younger learners or learners who might benefit from more support. So again, one of the comments I made in the chat window was that I use these routines with educators, these thinking routines all the time. So leading a session on metacognitive skill building, kind of ending with this idea of challenging you guys to think about coming into this session, what were you thinking about metacognitive skill building or metacognition? And now as you're exiting out of it, what are you thinking about it now? Has anything changed or developed or shifted as a result of this hour together talking about metacognitive skill building? Even for us as adult learners, it can be a nice way to kind of understand how a learning experience impacts our own thinking. So I would love to see any of you guys who are looking to kind of attend more of these in the future. So I have 3 of them scheduled for May. May 1st is engaging parents and family. May 8th is about ensuring equity and access for English language learners across learning environments. And then May 15th is how to create the social emotional learning classrooms. We'll be talking about the core competencies and how to develop them. So in your resource document, I have it linked to the solved page where you can sign up for those if you're interested. And then, like I said, at the start of our time together today, you can reach me and kind of find a bunch of different resources on my website, catlintucker.com. You can reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram if you have questions, want to connect. Thank you guys for spending the day with me. Just a couple of housekeeping. When you log into the webinar, it grabs your name, it grabs your email. And so that's how they do attendance. And then those of you who participated, who want the CLTE credits, you'll get them after today in the email that follows, I think within 24 or 48 hours, because I know I get a lot of questions on that. So I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and hopefully I'll see some of you back here on May 1st.